On a freezing winter night, 10-year-old Evan is found wandering alone in a snowstorm, clutching a desperate letter begging for rescue from his abusive foster parents. Taken in by a kind-hearted store clerk, Hannah, he reveals a heartbreaking secret. He's searching for his little sister, Maya, who was taken from him. As Hannah risks everything to protect Evan and uncover the truth, she faces a dangerous showdown with the foster parents and a race against time to reunite the siblings. Will Hannah's courage be enough to outsmart the system and the monsters who exploit it? And when the storm settles, will Evan and Maya finally find a place to call home? The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the narrow streets of the city as snow blanketed everything in sight. Under the dim, flickering glow of a street lamp, Evan stumbled forward, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his frostbitten hands. His coat, much too thin for the biting cold, flapped uselessly in the wind, and his small frame shivered violently. The letter, stained and torn at the edges, was addressed simply, "To whoever finds me." Inside a convenience store a few yards away, Hannah sighed as she stacked boxes of instant noodles onto a nearly bare shelf. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, froze mid-motion as a shadow passed by the frosted glass door. It was nearly midnight, and most customers had long since retreated to the warmth of their homes. Yet there he was, a boy barely 10, his face pale, lips tinged blue, and eyes wide with fear and desperation. She opened the door. "Hey, sweetheart," she called gently. "You're going to freeze out here." Evan hesitated, clutching the letter tighter as if it were a lifeline. His eyes darted to the dark street behind him, then back to her. "Please," he whispered, "don't send me back." Hannah's heart clenched. She recognized that tone, pure, unfiltered terror. Without waiting for an explanation, she ushered him inside, wrapping a blanket from her supply closet around his trembling shoulders. His hands were ice cold, and she noticed the raw redness of his cheeks, a sign he'd been out in the storm far too long. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Evan nodded hesitantly, his gaze fixed on the floor. She quickly heated a bowl of soup, the aroma of chicken and herbs filling the small break room. He ate in silence, but Hannah could see the faintest flicker of relief cross his face with each spoonful. As he finished, his voice broke the stillness. "I wrote this." He slid the letter across the table, his hand shaking. "In case something happened to me." Hannah opened the paper carefully. The handwriting was uneven, the words smudged as if written with frozen fingers. Her chest tightened as she read, "To whoever finds me, please don't take me back to them. They hurt me and don't feed me. I ran away because I couldn't stay there anymore. I'm not lying, I swear. Please just keep me safe. My name is Evan." She looked up, her throat tight with emotion. "Evan," she said softly, "where were you running from?" Before he could answer, a loud knock on the door jolted them both. "Police!" a voice boomed. "Open up!" Evan's eyes widened in panic and he darted to hide behind a stack of boxes. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Don't let them take me." Hannah's heart raced. She knew she should cooperate, but everything in her screamed that this boy needed her protection. Steeling herself, she walked to the door and cracked it open just enough to see the officer standing outside. "We're looking for a runaway," the officer said. "A boy, about 10 years old. Foster parents reported him missing earlier tonight." Hannah glanced back, seeing Evan's pleading eyes peek out from his hiding spot. She inhaled sharply. "I haven't seen anyone," she said firmly, the words tasting like fire in her mouth. "Maybe he went toward the park." The officer frowned. "Thanks," he said, tipping his hat. "We'll check there." As the police car's lights disappeared into the swirling snow, Hannah locked the door and turned back to Evan. "You can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'll find a place for you." Evan clutched the blanket tightly, his small face streaked with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw with gratitude. An hour later, bundled in extra layers Hannah had scrounged up, they trudged through the snow to an abandoned cabin at the edge of town. The roof sagged and the windows were cracked, but it would provide some shelter. Hannah lit a small kerosene lamp she'd brought and handed Evan a thermos of hot cocoa. "This is just for tonight," she said, kneeling to his level. "I'll figure out something better tomorrow. I promise." Evan nodded, his trust in her palpable, despite the fear that still lingered in his eyes. She adjusted the blanket around him and turned to leave, but his small voice stopped her. "Do you think it's okay to hope?" he asked quietly. Hannah froze. The question, so simple yet so profound, sent a shiver down her spine. She turned back, her expression softening. "Yes," she said firmly. "It's always okay to hope." Outside, the snowstorm raged on, but inside the small cabin, Evan drifted into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in months. Hannah stood in the doorway for a moment longer, clutching the letter tightly, and whispered to herself, "I'll keep you safe, Evan, no matter what." The morning light struggled to break through the thick gray clouds that hung low over the frozen town. Hannah stood by the window of her cramped apartment, staring at the icy streets below. Her breath fogged the glass as her thoughts churned. Evan was safe, for now, hidden in the abandoned cabin on the edge of town. But she knew the fragile peace wouldn't last. The police were already searching, and the boy's foster parents wouldn't let go without a fight. Her phone buzzed loudly, breaking her reverie. She snatched it up and saw an unfamiliar number. For a moment, her finger hovered over the answer button before she hesitantly pressed it. "Ms. Palmer?" a cold, clipped voice asked. "This is she," Hannah replied, her heart sinking. "This is Detective Carver with Child Protective Services. We understand you were working last night when Evan Turner was reported missing. His foster parents claim he may have sought shelter nearby. Did you see him?" Hannah swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. "No," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I didn't see him." There was a pause, the silence stretching unbearably. "If you hear or see anything, you're obligated to inform us immediately," Carver continued. "Interfering with a foster child's placement is a criminal offense." "Understood," Hannah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up and sank into a chair, her head in her hands. They were closing in, and she had no idea how long she could protect Evan without incriminating herself. The cabin was colder than it had been the night before. Evan huddled under the blankets Hannah had brought, his breath forming tiny clouds as he stared at the door. Every creak of the old wood made his heart race. He couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if they found him. He'd been through enough to know that promises of safety often came with a price he couldn't afford to pay. When Hannah arrived later that morning, carrying a backpack stuffed with food and an extra coat, Evan bolted to the door. "Are they coming?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No," she assured him, kneeling to his level. "Not yet, but we need a plan." Evan hesitated, then reached into the pocket of his oversized jacket. "I didn't show you this part before," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It was the second half of his letter, creased and worn from being held so tightly. He handed it to her with shaky hands. Hannah unfolded it and read silently. "If you can help me, please find my little sister, Maya. They took her away from me when we went into foster care. She's all I have, and I know she's still out there. I need her to know I didn't leave her. Please don't let her think I forgot about her." Her chest tightened, the words hitting her like a punch. "Your sister?" she murmured, meeting Evan's tear-filled eyes. "Do you know where she might be?" He shook his head. "No, they wouldn't tell me anything. But I heard them say she was sent somewhere far away. She's only 6. She's scared of the dark, and she doesn't like being alone." Hannah placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "We'll find her, Evan. I promise." Over the next few days, Hannah juggled her work shifts while secretly visiting Evan at the cabin, bringing him food and checking on his safety. But she wasn't the only one making moves. The foster parents, a burly man named Roy and his sharp-eyed wife, Denise, were growing suspicious of Hannah's involvement. One night, as she returned home, she found her front door vandalized, the word liar scrawled in red paint across the wood. Her hands trembled as she cleaned it off, her resolve hardening with every stroke. She knew she was up against dangerous people, but the fear in Evan's eyes, the desperation in his letter, it all made her decision clear. She couldn't give up, no matter the cost. Hannah began digging into Roy and Denise's past. Using old contacts and her sharp instincts, she uncovered whispers of neglect and abuse from other foster children they had taken in over the years. The allegations were chilling: withheld food, verbal torment, even physical punishment for minor mistakes. But there was no formal proof. Without concrete evidence, Evan's fate would remain out of her hands if they found him. As she pieced together the fragments of their dark history, the weather grew worse. A fierce blizzard swept through the town, cutting power lines and making the roads nearly impassable. Despite the danger, Hannah trudged through the snow to the cabin, her flashlight flickering against the swirling white. She found Evan curled up on the floor, trying to stay warm with the blankets she had brought. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's too dangerous." "You're worth it," she replied, pressing a thermos of hot soup into his hand. "I found something. It's not enough yet, but it's a start." "What happens if they find me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I can't go back. I'd rather—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "They won't," she said firmly, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. "I won't let them." As the storm raged outside, Hannah stayed with Evan, her mind racing with ideas on how to keep him safe. She couldn't stop thinking about Maya, about the little girl who was just as vulnerable as Evan, and the monstrous system that had torn them apart. Before she left the cabin at dawn, Evan grabbed her hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for believing me." Hannah squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with determination. "We'll find Maya," she promised, "and we'll make sure neither of you ever has to live like this again." But as she made her way back through the snow, the faint sound of an engine in the distance made her pause. A black SUV crept along the road toward the cabin. Her heart sank. Time was running out. The SUV's tires crunched on the icy road, sending a chill through Hannah as she crouched behind a row of snow-covered bushes. She clutched her scarf tightly against the biting wind, her breath misting as she watched Roy and Denise step out of the vehicle. Roy's bulky frame moved with purpose, while Denise scanned the area, her sharp eyes narrowing as if she could sense a presence in the shadows. Hannah's mind raced. The cabin was only 100 yards away, tucked deep in the woods. But Evan was defenseless if they found him. She had to act quickly, but one wrong move could give everything away. Inside the cabin, Evan sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing the faint patterns on the wooden planks. He had grown used to the cold gnawing at his fingers and toes, but the loneliness felt heavier each day. Hannah's visits gave him hope, but as he listened to the silence outside, an uneasy feeling crept over him. Then he heard it, the faint rumble of an engine, and his heart stopped. Scrambling to his feet, Evan peered through the crack in the boarded-up window. His pulse quickened as he recognized Roy's hulking figure and Denise's sharp features. Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. They'd found him. Hannah moved swiftly, cutting through the woods to circle back toward the cabin. She needed a distraction, anything to buy Evan time. Grabbing a large branch, she hurled it into the thicket across the road, the loud crash echoing through the trees. Roy spun around. "What was that?" he barked. "Probably just a deer," Denise replied, though her gaze lingered on the woods. Roy, however, wasn't convinced. He pulled a flashlight from the SUV and started toward the noise, his heavy boots leaving deep imprints in the snow. Evan's hands trembled as he rifled through his belongings, searching for something, anything, that could help him hide. His gaze fell on the letter Hannah had left behind, the words she had scrawled at the bottom. "Stay strong. I'm coming back." The door rattled suddenly and Evan froze. His breathing quickened as shadows passed over the small gaps in the boards. "Evan!" Roy's voice boomed. "You better open up, boy! We know you're in there!" Denise's icy voice followed. "You're only making things worse for yourself." Evan backed into the far corner, his small frame shrinking as fear gripped him. He clutched the letter tightly, whispering to himself, "Stay strong, stay strong." Hannah emerged from the woods behind the SUV, her heart pounding as she reached into her bag and pulled out a tire iron. Without hesitation, she smashed the vehicle's back window. The sound shattered the silence, drawing Roy's attention instantly. "What the—" Roy stormed back toward the SUV, flashlight swinging wildly. Denise followed, her face twisted in anger. Hannah darted back into the trees, her breath coming in quick, visible puffs. She knew she couldn't outrun them, but she didn't need to. She just needed to lead them away from the cabin. Inside, Evan heard the commotion outside and crawled to the window. He caught a glimpse of Roy and Denise stomping through the woods, their shouts fading as they chased after someone who was risking everything for him. Hannah. Tears blurred his vision as he realized what she had done. Clutching the letter to his chest, he made a decision. Hannah's legs burned as she pushed herself deeper into the forest, zigzagging through the trees. She could hear Roy's heavy breathing and the crunch of snow behind her, closer than she wanted. Her foot caught on a hidden root and she stumbled, falling hard onto the frozen ground. "Got you now!" Roy bellowed, closing in. Hannah scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. Roy's massive hand clamped onto her arm, yanking her back. "You think you're smart, huh?" he growled, his face inches from hers. "Let me go!" she spat, struggling against his grip. "Where is he?" Denise demanded, her eyes blazing with fury. "Where's the boy?" Hannah met her gaze, defiance burning in her eyes. "You'll never find him." Roy raised his free hand, but before he could strike, the piercing wail of a police siren shattered the tension. The red and blue lights illuminated the trees as the patrol car skidded to a stop on the road. "Police!" a voice commanded. "Step away from her!" Roy hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for Hannah to wrench herself free. She stumbled toward the officers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're looking for a boy," she said urgently. "But they're the ones who hurt him. You have to stop them." Roy and Denise were handcuffed on the spot, their protests drowned out by the blaring siren. Hannah watched as they were forced into the back of the police car, but her relief was short-lived. Evan. She bolted back toward the cabin, her boots slipping on the icy ground. When she reached the door, she found it slightly ajar, the faint glow of a lantern flickering inside. "Evan?" she called, her voice breaking. A small figure emerged from the shadows, his face streaked with tears, but his expression resolute. "I'm here," he said, clutching the letter tightly. Hannah dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms, her own tears falling freely. "You're safe now," she whispered. "They won't hurt you again." But even as she said the words, she knew this was only the beginning. Maya was still out there, and they had to find her before it was too late. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving a brittle, frozen stillness over the town. The cabin, though far from warm, felt like a sanctuary now that Roy and Denise were gone. Evan sat beside the flickering lantern, watching Hannah pace back and forth. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand as she waited for a call back from a contact at Child Protective Services. It had taken hours of explaining, pleading, and convincing the officers, but Roy and Denise were now under investigation. Yet the knot in Hannah's stomach wouldn't loosen. They had won this battle, but there was still one more fight left. Maya. It was nearly midnight when Hannah's phone buzzed. She snatched it up, her voice trembling as she answered. "Hello? Hannah, it's Martin. I've got news." The man on the other end was a social worker she had worked with years ago. "You were right. There's a record of Maya Turner. She was placed in a home about 60 miles from here 2 years ago." Hannah's relief was short-lived as Martin's tone darkened. "But the foster parents, the report doesn't look good. Neglect, possible abuse. CPS flagged the case, but it got buried under a backlog." Hannah's chest tightened. "Where is she now?" "I'm sending you the address. But Hannah, don't do anything reckless. This needs to go through proper channels." She hung up, glancing at Evan. He had fallen asleep on the blanket-covered floor, the letter still clutched in his hand. His small face, so often etched with worry, now looked peaceful in the soft lantern light. "I'm not waiting," she whispered to herself. The drive was treacherous, the roads slick with ice, but Hannah pushed forward. Evan sat in the passenger seat, bundled in blankets and gripping the letter like a talisman. He didn't ask where they were going. He seemed to sense that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. They pulled up to a dilapidated house at the end of a dark street. The windows were cracked, and the porch sagged under the weight of snow. Hannah's heart ached at the thought of Maya living here. "Stay in the car," she told Evan. "No," he said, his voice steady. "She's my sister. I'm coming with you." Hannah hesitated, but saw the determination in his eyes. Together they stepped out into the icy night. The door creaked open, and a wiry man with sunken eyes stared at them suspiciously. "What do you want?" he barked. "We're here for Maya," Hannah said, her voice firm. "We know she's here, and we're not leaving without her." The man's expression darkened. "You've got no right. Let her go!" Evan shouted, stepping forward. "She's my sister, and you don't get to hurt her anymore." The man's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a small voice called from inside. "Evan?" Hannah's breath caught as a little girl, no older than 6, appeared in the dim hallway. Her hair was tangled, and her oversized sweater hung off her thin frame, but her wide eyes were unmistakably like Evan's. "Maya!" Evan cried, rushing to her. He knelt, wrapping his arms around her as tears streamed down his face. "I promised I'd come back for you." Maya clung to him, her tiny hands clutching his coat as if afraid he might disappear. "I thought you forgot about me," she whispered. "Never," Evan said fiercely. "I'll never leave you again." The man lunged forward, but Hannah stepped between them, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You lay a hand on them, and I'll make sure you never see the outside of a prison again." At that moment, flashing lights illuminated the driveway as a CPS van and a police car pulled up. Hannah had called Martin on the drive, knowing they might need backup. The hours that followed were a blur of questions, reports, and tears. Maya was taken into custody by CPS, but this time, Hannah made sure they weren't separated. She filed the paperwork herself, her voice steady as she told the caseworker, "I'll take both of them. Whatever it takes, I'll be their guardian." The caseworker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, nodded. "It won't be easy, but if anyone can give them a home, it's you." Weeks later, the 3 of them stood in Hannah's small apartment, decorating a scrappy Christmas tree she had found at a thrift store. Maya carefully hung ornaments on the lower branches, while Evan placed a star at the top. Hannah watched them, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt in years. They weren't a conventional family, and the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, they were safe, together. As they stood back to admire the tree, Evan turned to Hannah. "You kept your promise. So did you," she replied, smiling through her tears. Maya tugged on her sleeve. "What happens now?" Hannah knelt, pulling both children into her arms. "Now," she said, her voice steady with love and determination, "we make a home." Outside, the snow began to fall again, but inside, the warmth of their newfound family filled every corner. If you enjoyed this story of love, resilience, and hope, subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment below. What moment touched your heart the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.